Right, so welcome back everyone. And welcome to those of you that are joining us online as well. In the second half this evening, we're going to have a talk from Prajnamanas. And I just thought I'd introduce Prajnamanas. So some of you might not know him. He was on the Dharma Night team for a long time. So he's teaching regularly, was helping out on the Monday night class. He's now not on the team, but he's very generously offered to come back and give talks occasionally, which I'm very, very pleased about, because I always really enjoy Prajnamanas' teaching. I think I got to know you when you first came along to Dharma Night, didn't it?
Or the winter retreat.
Or the winter retreat, yeah. And then you started coming along to the Monday night classes after that. So I've known Prajnamanas since he started coming to Monday nights as a newcomer. And I've just seen Prajnamanas engage very, very wholeheartedly with the teachings of the Buddha over years and years and years and years, and has now become this very, very wise being. And his name means mind of wisdom. And I always experience that with Prajnamanas. He's exceptionally clear and very, very warm at the same time. And I think those two qualities together are lovely. And I'm looking forward to hearing what he says this evening.
Thank you. Yeah. That was very clear and warm as well. Thanks, Karsh Mitra. Yeah, and thanks to the team for having me back for a talk. Yeah, very good to see you all. Lots of faces I don't know. Some I do. And hello from me online as well. If you're at home, good you can join us. I'm always about to say good to see you. Of course, I can't see you, but I'm glad you can tune in. Okay, so in case you're new to this bit of the class and you've been in the course next door, we always do meditation in the first half and talk in the second half on some theme or series. And I know that the team at the moment is going through, some Buddhist suttas, some texts from the canon of what we think are the oldest written versions of what the Buddha actually said. And I was told which ones you were doing before and after tonight, but I can't remember. I just imagined that they're all stories of people going to the Buddha with a question or something they're pondering, or the Buddha approaching people and giving some sort of inspired utterance that was memorized by the people who were present, by monks who became his followers, and eventually, hundreds of years later actually, written down, and then we come across them as part of what we're doing by coming to a Buddhist centre and practicing. I'm going to talk tonight about a text called the Kalama Sutta, which might be the most sort of famously misremembered Buddhist text there is. I don't think there are any very famous suttas, but this one, at least in butchered forms, has actually found its way onto T-shirts. And as Buddhist suttas go, that is fairly famous, if you see what I mean. But more on that in a minute. It's basically got two little sections in it, two paragraphs of what the Buddha says that are the main import of the text. And I'm going to talk about those, go into both those things. But first I'm going to conjure a little bit the world of the sutta. So where do these texts come from and what's going on in the little world before when we come across it? One of our teachers, Maitreya Bandhu, sometimes says you have to add a lot of water to the original Buddhist texts, and you can tell in that metaphor they can be rather dry. So also dry and terribly condensed, and sometimes hard to make something of, and sometimes a bit hard to be inspired by. I fully admit, as a Buddhist. I've never read all of them. There are thousands, so it would take a long time even if you set out to. But they take quite a bit of warming up, although you have to add quite a lot of water. So I'm going to have a go at adding water to two paragraphs of the Kalama Sutta, having kind of evoked the world a little bit. So in all of these texts, the original ones from what's known as the Pali Canon, you've usually got a little introduction telling you where you are, in whose province, who the people are who tend to be there, and then by paragraph 3 or 4, a cluster of these people have decided to go and see the Buddha because they have some sort of problem, or the Buddha, sometimes in the very first line, has gone to some people who he can tell needs their help and speaks to them. So the world of this sutta is a town called Kesaputta, and the people are the Kalamas. We're not told who the Kalamas are or were. It looks like they're a sort of clan or a people. I think they lived in smaller, I mean, it not being a globalised society at that time, obviously smaller sort of tribal groups. So the Kalamas, that may be 50 people, or it may be 5,000. I don't know enough of my northern Indian history to tell you. But they're in a town called Kesaputta, and they've heard that the Buddha's nearby. Okay? So a little bit about the context of that. You have to kind of not just cast your mind back, because we can't remember this being alive now, but imagine a little bit deeply, if you can, into a society that's got, as we would recognise it, no media of any kind. Well, that's not strictly true. There was writing at the time, but for example, the Buddha and his followers didn't practice it. It was actually he was slightly suspicious of it. I think it was so uncommon at the time that, one of the assumptions around it was if you need to write down what I'm saying, that in some way might mean you don't trust me, or who you're going to be showing this to afterwards, or why are you taking notes? Why don't you just listen, if you see what I mean? Because that was much more the custom. So it's not just that there's no TV, Instagram, whatever. It's that the whole culture was one of speaking and listening, much, much more. These stories are full of relative strangers bowling up to each other and with courteous greetings and exchanges getting into a dialogue. And the ones that have survived and made their way to us as Buddhists are, of course, dialogues about basically what is good or what is true. But it's quite common for people to say, who's your teacher, for example? So all these wanderers who would wear rag robes and sit under trees and meditate, and a lot of whom had left the home life altogether, would say to each other, who's your teacher and which Dharma do you follow? Dharma being teaching, basically. So in other words, who's your guru? It was one of the sort of polite inquiries people made of each other. So teachers' reputations spread a little bit. The Buddha's reputation kind of gathered during his life, such that by the time he died, we think thousands of people came to see him, and the roads were thick with wanderers and householders filing out of their huts and houses along the dirt tracks, just from a kind of, a rumour, a true rumour. But, Siddhartha Gautama is in the next village, everybody gets up and goes. If you want actually a much more poetic evocation of this world, read a poem called The Travellers from Orissa by Maitreya Bandhu. I think you can get his collections in the bookshop. He grew up in the Midlands in the 60s and 70s, and he really makes the two people who gave the Buddha his first meal sound like a bickering pair of Midlanders. It's very, very funny. But it's actually a conjuring of that world, northern India, 2,500 years ago, and what it would have been like, this event of going to see the Buddha. Really, really momentous. Actually, the narrator of the tale, it's a poem maybe, 8 or 10 pages long. The narrator of the tale is someone who's met the Buddha once as a young man and then makes a very difficult journey as an old man to see him again when he's heard that the Buddha is nearby. So the Kalamas have heard that the Buddha is nearby, and they decide to go and see him. So let's have a few words of the Buddha. Of the text. So The Kalamas of Kesaputta, it says, heard it said, Gautama, that's his name, the contemplative, has arrived at Kesaputta. He is indeed a blessed one, worthy and rightly self-awakened. And then there's lots and lots of other sort of epithets praising the Buddha, consummate in knowledge and conduct and so on, a knower of the cosmos, an unexcelled trainer of those persons ready to be tamed, and so on, through a kind of long formula. It's actually part of a text some of us chant every morning in meditation. But his fame by now includes things like knower of the cosmos. In other words, he seems to have one of the strongest reputations, is known as one of the wisest people you could possibly hear from. Unexcelled means kind of unbeaten, an unexcelled trainer of those persons ready to be tamed. And so on, long paragraph of introduction. It says he's expounded the holy life both in its particulars and in its essence. So they're getting quite particular about their praise. This is one Kalama going up to another saying he's in the next village and this is what he's like, or this is what he's said to be like. Including he's expounded the holy life in its particulars and its essence. In other words, the real meaning of it and kind of how you go about it. Its particulars, what you do day to day, or how you communicate it, the bits that it's made of, maybe meditation practices or particular emphases or phrases you can learn, but also its essence. I'm mentioning this because it will be important later. It's a bit like saying the letter and the spirit. So if somebody is unexcelled in both the letter and the spirit of what they're trying to teach, well, you can't beat that, can you? Because it's not just that they're highly inspired and highly sort of imbued with the wisdom that he's expounding. It's that he also knows how to express it in different situations. Okay. And they say, okay, yes, good idea. All the Kalamas get up and go some distance to go and see him. A lot of these texts are quite formulaic, partly because they memorised them by chanting them to each other, the monks. You would simply learn them by hearing other monks chant it and then kind of join in, and then some years later find yourself doing the same to the younger monks and nuns. Or basically they'd be sung, pretty much, these texts. So you've got a little list of how people greet him. There's a reason I'm going through all this detail. We're sort of zooming in on the Buddha gradually here. I hope that's all right. Well, I'll get to the point soon enough. So the Kalamas come to him. It says, some of them sat to one side of the Buddha, that is, having saluted him with their hands palm to palm over their hearts. Some of them sat to one side having announced their name and clan, and some of them sat to one side in silence. And there's several other grades of greeting that I haven't mentioned. But it's interesting that all of them are kind of respectful. So some of them are doing this mudra that's also been somewhat cheapened by WhatsApp. I use it. I throw it into some of my WhatsApps as well. It's all right, but you know what I mean. It's like a lot of kind of respect and reverence. They're perhaps more or less accepting him as their teacher, or at least bowing down to him. Some of them simply state their name and clan, say, I'm McDonaldson from Donaldson's Ridge or whatever, and sit down. And then the next person says, I'm so-and-so from this place, and sits down. And some of them just sit in silence. I kind of rather like that. And this, so far, is a typical world of a sutta. We don't actually know what the problem is yet, do we? The Kalamas have just got excited, heard that the Buddha's nearby, all got up and trooped over, sat down in their various ways. Maybe that's because they're all kind of different ages, have different relations to each other. Some of them are maybe elders of their clan, some of them are very young, maybe there's some children, they've been told just sit down in silence and don't touch anything. But they're all getting ready to hear the Buddha speak. And then one of the Kalamas is obviously their spokesperson and says what their difficulty is. So I'll read that bit, and then we'll go into kind of what the import of all this might be for us. Very nice and clear. So as they sat there, the Kalamas of Kesaputta said to the Blessed One, Lord, there are some Brahmins, that means holy men, There are some Brahmins and contemplatives who come to Kesaputta. They expound and glorify their own doctrines, but as for the doctrines of others, they deprecate them, revile them, show contempt for them, and disparage them. And then other Brahmins and contemplatives come to Kesaputta. Guess what they do? They expound and glorify their own doctrines, but as for the doctrines of others, they deprecate them, revile them, show contempt for them, and disparage them. They leave us absolutely uncertain and in doubt which of these venerable Brahmins and contemplatives are speaking the truth and which ones are lying. It's quite sort of strong, that ending, I think. Which ones are telling the truth, but also which ones are lying. In other words, who should we trust? So they've got quite an important thing on their mind, and that's what I wanted to talk about this evening, and that's why I've called the talk A Basis for Truth. They're saying, how do you know what's true? How do you decide who to follow? It looks as though there's so many holy men who sort of breeze through this village, basically trashing other people's ideas and saying mine are the right ones. But in that sense, they all resemble each other and they keep blowing through the village, if you see what I mean. And how do you know which one has value? Where do you place your own trust? Even where do you place your attention? So that's the first of the two parts of the text I wanted to talk about. There's a kind of confusion of voices. All these Brahmins and contemplatives, all these holy men, obviously have a lot of conviction, because not only do they disparage, revile, etc., the views of others, they expound and glorify their own doctrines, actually glorify their own ideas. They don't just argue that they themselves are right. They probably say things like, this, my way, is the only way, it's the way to the beyond, this is how you get into heaven, this is what you should do if you want a good life, or you don't want to be punished by the gods, or whatever system they were in, because there was a whole ferment of different beliefs at the time, hence the confusion of the Kalamas. So what does that remind you of? There's no right answer, I'm just curious. What does this remind you of? This confusion of voices, everybody very convinced. Yeah? Politics, yeah. Religion, yeah, could be.
Even the online words.
The online world, absolutely, yeah. What sort of thing? What are you thinking of?
All the different theories of how you should live, or how should you put your priorities on where, and so yeah, it's a constant going through selection of what to hear and what to listen to.
Quite, yeah. You get bombarded, don't you? Yeah. I quite simply, I just thought of YouTube. I mean, I don't know if YouTube's now an outdated reference. We're on YouTube right now, aren't we? So it can't be.
It's the place to be.
It's the place to be. Okay, phew. I sometimes be there, so yeah. The online world looks more and more. Well, they came up with that thing, YouTube Shorts, didn't they, to grab you even more quickly with something now in capital letters. And they love that thing where someone is trashing someone else's idea and then expounding their own, don't they? It's like, all you need to do is 100 pull-ups a day and you'll live till you're 100 or something. If you can fit it into 3 lines, maybe it'll grab people, and if it's less than a minute long, maybe they'll watch it, and then maybe they'll feel dizzy and buy your product out of desperation. Yeah. Just to sum up a whole. I'm not against social media altogether, by the way. I'm just. Anything else kind of reminds you of? We've probably had the main ones, but I won't have thought of everything yet.
Like self-help books.
Self-help books, yes, I think that's quite right. Yeah. That's the kind of the long form version, isn't it? Yeah. Lots of ways you can. Well, optimise your life. Actually, that's what I thought. It made me think of the sphere of politics as well, which seems to be, at least as presented by the media, who are of course involved, so much to do with trashing the other side. I don't know if it was always to do with that. Maybe on some level it was as well. I don't know. But what I notice, at least in the things that YouTube feeds to me, is that it's not just pumping one ideology against another. It's encouraging more and more and more the optimization of you as an individual, sort of ahead of all other individuals. This is how to have the best health, the best fitness, make $1 million. That seems to be a big thing, like how to make $1 million. And they really sort of shout it at you, and it's really, really simple. But all to do with kind of optimizing your life. It's made kind of deeper and worse, this tendency for us to atomize ourselves off from everything else and try to sort of breathlessly improve our own life endlessly. That's the slightly painful thing about it, isn't it? That you can seem to be able to endlessly improve your life, even if you thought you were quite well off, fairly fit, ate decently, and took regular exercise. Apparently there's still dozens of things you're supposed to be doing that you're not doing, and that's why you're not earning your $1 million by 30 or whatever. And it's rather tiring, isn't it? That's one of the effects I think that it has. There's uncertainty, but it also in itself is tiring. Just the multiplicity of topics, I think, is a bit overwhelming. So just before coming down, I had a glance at... I just opened YouTube on my phone, thought I won't do anything else, I went to search for anything, and what's it say? So the first thing was the psychological drivers of the meta-crisis. Oh my God. The next was called mistake-free writing. I thought, maybe I've been making some mistakes, and they know. The next one was Joaquin Phoenix calls out Leonardo DiCaprio. I've been on retreat, so I don't know what the news is between those two or what he's being called out on, but there's usually somebody being called out on something, isn't there? Awards ceremonies nowadays seem created to sort of mean that someone's going to be really upset with someone else. But anyway, debunking C.S. Lewis. I thought that was... I don't know what he's done wrong. He wrote some children's stories that I think I read. I can't remember which ones they are. A Tolstoy short story, a medley of Irish tunes, and then one that simply said, drive the world's best-selling car from $399 a month. I'm quite far from being an owner of any car, let alone the world's best-selling one, so I don't know how that one found its way in, but there we are. I can trace more or less the Tolstoy short story, the medley of Irish tunes, and maybe the psychological drivers of the meta-crisis. So those are probably all, except for the expensive car, thoughts that I've had. They get reflected back really loudly by people wanting, if not to sell a product, possibly worse, sell an idea and convince you of their school. So I think this problem that the Kalamas are having has definitely not gone away. With the key difference, as I say, that at least in their dilemma, they're wondering what is true and who should I follow. We've got this added layer now that what we're being told is not who should you follow and what is true, but what should you buy and kind of who should you hate sometimes, I think. Who should you trash and revile and despise and get angry with and so on. That seems to be increasing more and more, that kind of polarisation. Anyway, I think we can probably all empathise with that kind of whirlwind of influences that's possibly noisier than it's ever been before. Okay, so let's have the second paragraph. The Buddha starts to respond. They're saying, which ones are speaking the truth, which ones are lying, and this leaves us in uncertainty. He says, of course you are uncertain, Kalamas. Quite a kind beginning, isn't it? And in fact, from the very start, he's not doing what the others have done. Okay, he's not trying to grab their attention and drag it in yet another direction. He says, of course you're uncertain, Kalamas. Of course you're in doubt. So in this case, Kalamas, and here's the famous bit that's made it onto the T-shirts, don't go by reports, by legends, by traditions, by scripture, by logical conjecture, by inference, by analogies, by agreement through pondering views, by probability, or by the thought, this contemplative is our teacher. So there's another bit I'll come on to. This has sometimes been taken to mean you don't need to worry about what the religious people are telling you. Well, in a sense, that's true. You don't need to worry about it. And just because somebody is a contemplative or a religious person is not in any way connected with them being necessarily right or worth listening to. The people with the loud hailers at Oxford Circus come to mind. I don't know if they still do that, but sometimes they've got megaphones, haven't they, to grab your attention. He's saying you don't have to go by reports, by legends, by traditions, by scripture, etc. So I don't know if this is familiar. There's sometimes, I didn't manage to look up the T-shirt slogan bit, but sometimes Buddhism is represented as saying, all you have to figure out is what your thing is. You don't have to worry about what any of those other people have said you're supposed to be doing. You just figure it out yourself. Is that familiar? Mostly head shakes. Okay, that's good. I wish I could quote one of the T-shirts. I can't. What the Buddha will come on to stress later is that you've got to test something in your own experience and not simply take it on trust. That's probably the most famous and slightly out of context emphasis of the Kalama Sutta. But he says, don't go by reports, by traditions, by scripture or by logical conjecture. Quite interesting, isn't it, given that Buddhism is such a rich tradition? He's saying, don't go by traditions. Why do you think he might be saying that? Not that he intended to found a tradition, by the way, he just broke through from suffering and wanted to help other people do that. The tradition came later, but why might he say, don't go by tradition?
Is it because you're not actually thinking about what you're doing? You're just kind of following something for the sake of the action instead of thinking why?
Yes, it might be. Yeah. A tradition. Yeah, you're not thinking for yourself. Yeah. Any other reason?
Times change.
Oh, yeah.
So tradition isn't necessarily always the most up-to-date means to do something.
Yes, times change, yeah. So tradition needs interpreting, that's probably what I would say. Yeah, rather than sterilising, fossilising at one point and simply being repeated. Yeah. Anything else? What might be wrong with a tradition?
Just because people have been doing something for a long time doesn't mean that it's right.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Just because it's how things have been done is not a reason to do it. I suspect that the main thing he means here is and you hear this as a justification, don't you? Not uncommon in a workplace, or perhaps any organised activity, that, no, this is how we always do it. I think it's referring to something, it might be as informal or as familiar as that. This is how it's done. And you might want to ask in a particular situation why, and the answer might simply be the same line pretty much again, because that's how we do it. I think he's trying to debunk something like that. You don't need to simply do something because it's what people have done before. Yeah. Anything else on tradition? I've got one or two things to add. There's a very good quote by the composer Gustav Mahler. I didn't know it till I saw it on the website of one of our retreat centres. I'm not full of Mahler quotes, but I think it's very, very good. It says, tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the handing on of a flame, which I thought was, very, very good. It's a sort of two-sided metaphor about fire, isn't it? Fire produces ashes, and why worship them? Why not instead hand on the flame? So what does that suggest? The flame rather than the ashes.
Can you say it again, please?
Sure. Tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the handing on of the flame.
So it needs to stay alive. It
Yeah.
can't just die.
Quite.
Dry out.
Yeah. In fact, I find this, exactly, it needs to stay alive rather than dry out, more useful than the line itself, this metaphor, because the representation of tradition as a fire. It sounds quite a lot more boring than that, doesn't it, tradition? If I think back to my childhood, it's what sounds like things that are stale and previous. You see what I mean? I've got another view of it now since becoming Buddhist, but a flame is always consuming itself and renewing itself, isn't it? and it's always in movement. You can't click save on a flame. It's burning all the time. That's its only existence, and it's alive, exactly. Yeah. So what might that suggest? Let's just do a little bit more, just hear from you a little bit more. What might that suggest about our spiritual life if it's going to be more like a flame than the ashes?
That it's constantly evolving and changing.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and there might be an even better term than constantly evolving and changing, because I suppose if one constantly changed something or changed it altogether, it wouldn't any longer be the tradition, would it? Something like the Buddhist tradition contains, well, we think we're in touch with at least some things that the Buddha said and practiced. That's what tradition is for us. But the real key is what we do with that is practice it. So if the Buddha did something like the mindfulness of breathing, we do the mindfulness of breathing in order to get back towards something like the state that the Buddha would have been in when he did it, rather than in order to do the mindfulness of breathing. Does that make sense? The point of doing the mindfulness of breathing isn't to do lots of mindfulness of breathing. It's to make the mind absorbed, deeper and more creative, and able to penetrate more into the heart of reality. After we'd done that, we probably wouldn't exactly need the mindfulness of breathing anymore. We might want to do some mindfulness of breathing to refresh the mind at particular times. And it looks as though the Buddha, when he needed a rest, became absorbed, probably in something like the breath, or simply his own experience. If he'd been doing a lot of communicating, a lot of teaching, perhaps a lot of thinking, it looks as though he would withdraw, become more absorbed. So he might want it, but wouldn't need it anymore. So there's a little day-to-day example for us of how it might be the handing on of the flame, is if we teach the mindfulness of breathing, or if we go on retreat, say, and have a deeper experience of the mindfulness of breathing, we might think, that's the point of it. You see what I mean? Rather than you place a number at the end of the out-breath, or you place it at the beginning of the in-breath, and feel a bit engaged and a bit bored by turns until the bell. Not entirely speaking for myself, but sometimes. So what it's trying to be a channel for something that can't be grasped in a form. That's what I really mean. Ashes are a sort of form, aren't they? They sort of, they get on your clothes and you've got to dust them into the bin. A flame is sort of a form, but so much more subtly. It's hardly a form. It's completely fascinating, isn't it? You look at a flame, you cannot really even quite look at it. Hopefully a tradition is like that. Our teacher Sangharakshita says that if people are looking for a sense of belonging with their spiritual life, they might get very, very concerned with lineages, okay? Which is the ability to trace your teacher through his teacher and her teacher all the way back to the Buddha. And if you can write it down and form a sort of unbroken chain, you must be in a legitimate lineage, which means that your Buddhism must be kind of proper. Again, I don't know if that's familiar. It's a completely different culture, by the way, so I don't mean to dig into it, actually, but Tibetan Buddhism, for example, can be particularly concerned with lineages and who was your teacher's teacher and their teacher's teacher. But our teacher says there's nothing in that particularly transcendental. In fact, it's got nothing to do with the transcendental. The ability to trace your teacher, even if it were back to the Buddha. Because say you didn't have all those teachers in the middle and you yourself met the Buddha, there's no guarantee that if the Buddha said to you, all conditioned things are impermanent, that you would immediately ken that, go into a deeply absorbed, inspired state, and break through into enlightenment like he did. So what this point about tradition, I think, is really saying is that there's no thing that's handed on, because you can't take the enlightened state, or even an inspired state actually, and give it to somebody. Slightly sort of painful truth in a way, because sometimes we might meet people who really are inspired and we want the thing that they've got. There's a slightly mistaken idea there, which produces a mistaken idea of traditions, which is that there's a thing passed on. So if it's passed down from X to Y to Z to A to B to U, you've got it. You're in possession of the real Dharma. And you hear that phrase, the real Dharma, Dharma being Buddhist teaching. And Buddhists will disparage other Buddhisms by saying that's not the real Dharma, this is the real Dharma, sometimes on the basis of the fact that they can trace a line of teachers. But it actually seems rather obvious as a refutation of that, doesn't it, that that's no guarantee of spiritual attainment. Why would it be that someone very gifted has taught us? We might have been completely unreceptive to that. So I think what what Gustav Mahler was probably saying, it's the handing on to the flame, meant, to continue the fire metaphor, that all that tradition really is a sparking off of the other person. You cannot give them the thing, you can only spark them off. So adding water to this particular remark of the Buddha's, he's not trashing tradition altogether. He's saying you need to do something that's alive, and you know in your experience is alive and vigorous and fruitful. Okay, so time's running on. I better not do all the other ones, scripture and logical conjecture and so on. Let's see where I want to go. Okay. So he's said what not to go by. Yep. And I've gone into tradition a bit, or a mistaken idea of tradition. Now he's going to give them some of the real criteria, some more reliable criteria. Probably these holy men have said, this is what's in scripture, therefore this is what you do. And he's saying, there's no need to go with that. Or they've said, this is how it's been done for thousands of years, so I'm afraid this is how it is. He's saying, there's no obligation to agree to that. It's rather freeing. He says instead, when you know for yourselves that these qualities are unskillful, that means unethical, basically. These qualities are blameworthy. These qualities are criticised by the wise. These qualities, when adopted and carried out, lead to harm and suffering, then you should abandon them. And later he flips that to the positive. So much later he says, when you yourselves, quite emphatic, when you know for yourselves, not just because you've been told it, when you know for yourselves that these qualities are skillful, these qualities are blameless, these qualities are praised by the wise, these qualities, when adopted and carried out, lead to welfare and happiness, then you should enter and remain in them. Okay? This is the kind of nub. This is where he's saying it's up to you to decide what you think is really true, but here are some ways of testing it. Are they skillful? That means, do they conduce to positive states because they help you and the world? Not are they written down thousands of years ago? So the great thing about this is it applies just as much to what he's saying. What he positively doesn't do in this is say, believe me, it's like this. He's saying, was throwing it back to you. He's saying, when you yourself know that this is skillful, in other words, if this has good results for you and your conscience, if you feel when you get up in the morning that you're not really quite ashamed of what you did the previous day, well then, that previous day has probably got one or two keys in it for how you should live. These qualities are blameless, that's pretty much the same. These qualities are praised by the wise. Well, we'll come on to that now. These qualities, when adopted and carried out, lead to welfare and happiness. Basically, what are the results? Not where does it come from or how apparently authoritative is it, but what are the results? Okay. So the really challenging thing about this is that we're being enjoined to be both receptive and responsible. So I'll say where I've got both those things from. He says, doesn't he, if these things are criticised by the wise, avoid them. If these things are encouraged by the wise, do them. So why might he be including that? Because you get 2/3 of the way through the sutta and you think, okay, great, he's telling me I don't need to worry about tradition or what's in scripture. I can work it out for myself. I can test it in my own experience. It's there for verifying rather than just signing up to. Or what might be the problem of following what the wise say. It's in a sort of new category, isn't it?
You're going against sort of the status quo of what was already done. It could end up making you unpopular amongst others, or making your life challenging.
Mm-hmm. So yes, you
But
could.
that should be a reason to be fearful.
Right, I'm glad you added that. Yeah, you were saying if you go against the status quo, it could make you unpopular. Yes, and I was going to ask, is that a reason not to do it? But no, exactly. Does anyone not agree? Does anyone think we should really only decide for ourselves?
I don't disagree, but I just think it's kind of sounds like you're running into the same problem again. Like they were, you saying don't believe these people, but then trust the wise and stuff.
Yes. Yeah, so how do you... Yeah, that's a good problem with it, isn't it? How do you avoid the same trap where I've said pursue what the wise encourage? Yeah. Any ideas? Sorry, I'm making you do the work.
I think, again, like, kind of following that same thing that you said about with skillful, like how does it make you feel, how does it affect your conscience, like what you're hearing and stuff, using that as like a guide.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the point I was coming to is that there are lots of criteria here. I just think it's very interesting that one of them is the counsel of the wise. But as you say, there's also testing it in your own experience. So what this starts to get at, I think, is something we were reflecting on this weekend retreat I've just come home from this afternoon, which is that you've got a kind of twin criterion in Buddhism. You've got to be open and receptive in order to hear teaching and in order to take something in. On the other hand, you never abandon your own responsibility. That's really the nub of this, I believe, that he's not saying, never mind what other people tell you, just do your thing. It's the counsel of the wise that gets left out of the misquoted versions of this sutta. And testing it in your own experience is the bit that we tend to like, because it could justify us simply following what makes us feel good, which is not necessarily the counsel of the wise. If you have a wise friend, or you've spent quite a lot of time around someone who's a bit more wise or experienced than you, you'll know that they're going to tell you to do things that are not always comfortable for you. And they're not always going to tell you, I'm afraid, just follow your impulse. What would be the point in their wisdom or being around it if that were the case? You've got this twin principle of being open to what wise people say, but never handing over your responsibility to them. And this, I think, is the really subtle, kind of challenging takeaway from all of this for me. So if I wanted you to remember one thing this evening, it would be this, that if we really want to learn what is true and have something we can trust, even participate in a tradition that we can trust and love, that will involve us to some extent opening our heart to it. Actually, not just to some extent, eventually opening our heart completely. But how do you do that without just handing over your will? It's quite a problem. And we were being invited, one of the kind of challenging aspects of this retreat, to reflect on whether we overdid the receptivity or overdid the self-responsibility. So here's what I think those two might look like. If we overdo the receptivity, we always want to know what other people think. In fact, we're anxious to ask them and have them tell us. We might want a lot of personal feedback. We might, get into that quite common worry that one of our ideas isn't liked. Maybe we ourselves aren't liked. We want a lot of reassurance. We're often needing to hear, what do you think? Yeah. And it matters in a sense slightly too much, or it matters in a slightly unbalanced way. So we've handed over some of our responsibility for deciding what we think to somebody else. If we overdo the self-responsibility, what that looks like is being rather closed to input from other people, deciding we know best, and somehow coming up with the theory that we've got all of the equipment we need for knowing what's true, which, when you think about what a human being is rather absurd. We've got this sort of limited brain, this probably temporary period on the planet during which the conditions are livable for this species. Our history has, thrown up all sorts of ideas about gods and godlessness, burrowed with science to the kind of centre of the earth and the corners of the universe. And yet, how could we have understood it all? How could we encompass all that simply with our own awareness and just imagine that we've controlled it because we've understood a few ideas? Which probably, if we haven't digested them very well and we're not very integrated, have basically come from our upbringing and the media we've read and the preferences it suited us to have. So if we decide that we know best, we don't need to hear from other people. And you get this sometimes if, particularly as we get older, it's harder not to do. Deciding that you know basically how things work, what other people are like, and you've seen it all before. Yep. That's what it looks like if you overdo your own idea of authority or your own self-responsibility. So somehow we've got to enter this really difficult sort of balanced place, but hopefully eventually a transcending place where we're open to the teachings of the Buddha ultimately. But probably in our experience day to day, that will be people a little bit wiser than us, a little bit further along the path, but we don't fall into that trap of doing something because they told us we'd do it and resenting it later. I must say, by the way, I don't know if it's possible for most of us to simply avoid that trap off the bat and just know that that's the trick. Probably if we take up the Dharma life in a more committed way, what will happen is we'll ping between these two things. I don't know if the other order members in the room agree, this is my experience anyway, probably ping between these two poles a lot. Probably slightly overdo what do others think, or slightly overdo I don't need to hear it. Like I've heard it all before. Or even I've heard a lot of Buddhism, I've been to loads of talks. I've read lots of suttas now, I can roughly remember what they say. The Buddha, I remember what he's thought to, what he's known for. It can even get like this if we sometimes do exercises where you're given a subject and you've got to give a talk just like that. No warning, a room full of people, other order members waiting for you to start. Good exercise. The risk is that you start believing you can just whip out bits of the tradition with no preparation and you kind of know it. It's at your fingertips, therefore it must be somewhere close to your heart in your understanding. Again, hope I'm not speaking too personally here. Got to remember. Where am I? Yeah, that balanced place between those two things. So where I think this is leading is what we call Kalyana Mitrata or spiritual friendship, because I think that is going to be the locus of this type of communication where we've got an opportunity to be open to somebody a bit wiser than us, but probably get a bit into the exercise of, have I handed over a bit too much for them, or am I being a bit defended? I've just had an episode of this weekend. At first, when we were invited to decide which one are you doing more of, I just thought, oh God, it's both. I'm not receptive enough, I'm not individual enough. And then I had a phase of thinking it's this one, and I had a phase of thinking it's the other one. And what that told me is, well, they both need a lot of work. But in the end, I decided I have become a bit accustomed to what we're doing, a bit accustomed to talking about the Dharma, and subtly, without me noticing, that had slightly closed me off, slightly got me into the habits of the spiritual life, where you turn up to things. I live in a community, I teach down here, I work for our order, sometimes lead retreats, and sometimes I just get into the habit because I know what you're supposed to do at different moments. Lots of us do. You know how to turn up to something in a basically friendly state, go through the motions, build a shrine, cook a meal, give a talk, and unfortunately, as you go over the years, you can keep falling into these traps of kind of thinking you know, and forgetting that actually you need the counsel of the wise. Or always wanting to know what your wise friends think, and maybe one of the things they want to say to us is that maybe you need to decide for yourself. Maybe you know what you need to do, but you're a bit addicted to asking other people. I know one person at least, every time he sees me, says, what shall I do next? What shall I do next? And I sometimes think the only answer I can think of is move on from that tendency, if you see what I mean, which isn't quite what he wants to hear. But it's because it's become a habit, asking order members, what's my next step? What's my next step? And it's you've got to sort of somehow stay in relationship, but help the person, help ourselves come out of that sort of trap. The reason I'm talking about friendship in this type of communication is, another emphasis we were being given this weekend is to do with what that's going to look like in our life. So we're probably not going to have loads of holy men as gifted as the Buddha blowing through our village, so that we can ask them, who do we trust? In the time of the Buddha, that was the opportunity, and that's how people lived and behaved, because there were not just holy men, but that holy man, the Buddha, the man who'd actually broken through from suffering. And you could, if you were lucky enough and he came near enough to your village and you could walk there, ask him a question. Hundreds of years later, the tradition needed a way of responding to the fact that he was no longer there. Whole sort of, that's a kind of crisis in itself, the Buddha not being there. That spawned a load of imaginative aspects of the tradition, that you can't ask the Buddha a question anymore. One emphasis it produced was that if you can't do what we call, if the jewel, you've been learning on the introductory course about the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, if the Buddha jewel isn't there, how do you bring the Buddha jewel into your own life? What's that actually going to mean for you? Because it's very interesting hearing the story of the Buddha, and maybe it's inspiring. You hear that he left the palace, he went forth, he sought the truth, all very good. What does it mean for you? When you get up tomorrow and go about your day, what difference is that going to make? Or in your own experience, what is that Buddha jewel going to be? And the later tradition said, the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, in your own experience, you need what they called esoteric versions of those. But without going into that, it means something direct in your experience now that you can cultivate and be in contact with. And instead of the Buddha, it gave the Guru. It said the Guru. Forgetting that word, which you can have whole study groups discussing the problems of, what it really means is a more experienced friend. The word's been discredited, and I understand why. It's actually a slightly sarcastic word now, and you get marketing gurus instead of spiritual ones who know how to make you, get that car for $399 a month or whatever it was. Know how to get that to my phone. It really means a more experienced friend, somebody a bit wiser. That's how, in our own day-to-day experience, to actually be in relationship to somebody who can help us tread that line where we're receptive enough to keep taking in things that actually we've heard dozens of times before. And if you come along here for 3, 6 months, 6 years, you'll have heard some of this stuff dozens of times. The challenge is staying open to it and hearing it again and again so that it can actually affect you, while cultivating your own sense of what's true, what's the next step for me, and how do I keep this in relationship to the beautiful aspect of the tradition that I've inherited, rather than the ashes which I've decided I don't need to worship. So in a world after God, and one in which there aren't lots of contemplatives going through our town, and in one where every day you're going to be told dozens of different ways in which you're supposed to not just optimize yourself but get rich, and not just get rich but manage your mind, that I think is at least an easily memorable way to take it forward, is to be open enough to the truth while developing our own sense of what that is. Okay, So I hope that's at least a very, very brief look at the Kalama Sutta. I've only quoted about 1% of it, so you'll have to go home and read it. But that's the sort of main import, and well, I hope that's attracted you to hearing more about Buddhist suttas in the coming weeks, if you can. Maybe reading a bit of what the Buddha said, but knowing that you've got to add a lot of water. And even when you read a Buddhist text, you've got to talk about what it might mean with others and not make it suit your own meaning somehow, and yet never abandon that responsibility to turn things over for yourself and actually, in a way, we are the ones who are deciding in the end. It is actually our life. It does belong to us, and that's part of what I think the Buddha is saying to the Kalamas. Of course you're uncertain if these things happen. Here's some equipment for you to cultivate your own spiritual life and grow your mind in a way that you can actually trust. Okay, good. So I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening, and why don't you stay around for a ritual? We've done necessarily. That's a lot of ideas in that sutta. So probably the best way to relax again and cultivate some more of that trust, sometimes called faith. I prefer saying trust. That trust in the fact that you can move towards this ideal while balancing these qualities is a Buddhist ritual. So you can sort of give yourself up to that a bit after the thinky bit that we've been doing. Yeah. Good. So where are we? Maybe 6 or 7 minutes to turn the room around, and then a ritual if you want to stay for it. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much.